So I listen to a lot of the players who I'm writing for. It's sort of a huge issue, when writing a new piece of music, do you write it for certain people specifically, or do you write it to be performed and reperformed and sort of give it that openness that allows it to be interpreted by many people?
Mhm.
For the most part, I write for the person who is going to premiere the
Mhm.
piece or people. So I listen to their music and how they are. For example, I listen to your Clyburn
Ooh.
videos. No. And so that's why your piece was so difficult, and I'm sorry.
Ah.
um, so the title of your piece was Bent Kiddo, and the title before your piece was so just the word was. And then, I mean, it's sort of like a narrative among the titles. So writing was last year, I kind of knew that I was ending a period of my life that of my musical life that was sort of craving to be over.
Mm.
But I knew I had to sort of end it with thoughts of the past. And um, so Bent Kiddo is sort of this culmination of, I mean, it feels silly because I am not so old, but it's a culmination of my younger life. Bent Kiddo, which is sort of hinting at there are these, there's something about it that will be kind of crooked, and there's something that's bent also means drunk or also queer. There's some othering aspect of it.
There was a poem before the music. Can you talk a little bit about the poem?
So I don't call it exactly a poem, even though it
Okay.
looks like one.
You call it
It's not,
program note.
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
you call
it's,
it program note.
if I really was serious about it, I would call it a linearly non-linear uh, verbal guide to my music from the
Cool.
last few years.
Very cool.
But I'm not so serious, so I call it a program note. And yeah, but so each stanza is it correlates to a piece that I've written. And so it started at the end of 2019.
Mm.
And so up until Bent Kiddo and including Bent Kiddo, there are 7 works. It started as a triptych, actually, like as a trio of works that were meant to document and sort of help me remember a period of grief and of healing in a sense. But then it sort of continued, and I realized that maybe 3 works is not enough to contend with the grief that I experienced. And so, yeah, it ended up taking 7 pieces in a total of 2 years. So the idea was that I would create this sort of emotional map of of this time in my life and of all of these really painful memories, and so that I wouldn't forget, but I would also, respect this period and understand it as a vital aspect of my continuing life.
Yeah. So, you mentioned to me that you come from a musical family. Your mom and your grandpa are all composers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So yes, my mom is a composer as well, and she taught me, and she reluctantly taught me um, at a young age. And my first piece, it was for solo piano. I was 9 years old,
Mm,
and I just played it for her. And it was memorized in my head, and I didn't really know how to write music yet,
mm,
and or it was too complicated for me to write or something. So she dictated the whole thing, um, as I played it slowly. And I remember looking at the final score and just being like amazed that um, this thing in my head is now like brought out into my hands, and it was a very good feeling. Um, but anyway, so my mom she's a fantastic composer, and it is such a privilege and joy to be able to talk to her almost as if outside of this parent child relationship into this sort of more metaphysical world of music making, and really what it means to make music now. So I always send her my scores, and I talk about her scores, and it's a very special thing in my life that I'm very grateful for.
You told me that your mom's side was from China and she immigrated to this country. You were born here, so you are a first generation immigrant. Can you talk a little bit about being the first generation immigrant in America and how this impacted your work?
When you asked me to do this interview, it did suddenly dawn on me that I am in fact a first generation immigrant. I mean, I always knew that, but I think because of my other half, which is white American,
Yep.
and because none of my Chinese family is in the US, I never really felt like I belonged to this name of first generation immigrant.
Yep.
It didn't really affect my experience growing up. I grew up in rural Ohio, and my sister and I were, among the handful of people of color in our school. And it wasn't, I mean, I don't know how to talk about it. I mean, it wasn't the easiest in a way. I mean, because of our looks, we were kind of ridiculed a little bit, and also the garlic in our lunches was a big deal at school. But I am a native English speaker. Although Chinese was technically my first language until I was 3. We lived in Beijing for a year. I was able to defend myself in English. And I don't know, it always felt like an armor that many people who label themselves or are labeled as immigrants in the US do not have access to that defense mechanism sometimes.
Yeah, indeed. I do have friends who are biracial as well, and they sometimes talk about the struggle between white or Asian. It's almost like a fluid thing. It's not set in stone, and you feel different every day about yourself. Do you also have that kind of feeling?
I've never felt too confused, to be honest, to be fully honest. I've always felt like me. And I think
That's great.
it has
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it has a lot to do with my being gay and the queerness of my gayness, also within the context of rural Ohio, mixed in with my mixture of ethnicities. And I think it all for me was labeled queer. That, I mean, just existing in a body is quite a queer experience.
Wow.
And this
The otherness.
fluidity, the otherness
Yeah.
of it. This fluidity aspect has been really interesting to me. I've been reading Donna Haraway a bit. I mean, she's a biologist, and she talks about how human nature is interspecies relationship. This is like a core aspect of what it means to be human, or human in quotes. She says that our bodies are made up of cells, millions of cells, and 10% of those cells you are able to find the human genome within.
Mm.
But the other 90% all come from genomes of bacteria, protists, and fungi. And so in fact, our humanness is entirely dependent on the fluidity of and the movement of our cells, incorporating other species. And in fact, we are not as human as we
Mm.
think we are. And
Mm.
so I've been thinking about this a lot with in relationship with cohabitation with an animal. So what happens to my humanness when I live with my dog?
Mm.
What happens to her dogness when I am here infiltrating? My human cells are always in flux between our microbiomes. And in the pandemic, I never left home. So like our bond became extremely strong and sort of
Mm.
fraught with a lot of difficulties now that the world is opening up. But this idea that our identities are not ever fixed, and this meanness that I felt as a child was in fact a bothness or an allness with rural Ohio, where I shared myself with all the species that I grew up around. And this idea makes me very happy.
Mm.
It doesn't, of course, change the fact that the representation of my identities through my physical appearance and
Mm.
voice and behaviors as a gay person in this context, it doesn't negate the fact that that was a little bit othering, and still is in some way. So this Donna Haraway notion of physically and cellularly fluid bodies and selves and identities, it's in relation to life, the system of life on Earth.
Right.
And somehow that makes it really okay for me. I don't know. Yeah. you.